Hello, Sex Reality Bites here, where I upcycle, clip, and caption public hate-free talks that promote respectful yet critical discourse about gender. Words matter. Sources linked in the description for context and credit. Thanks so much for watching.
It's a logical proposition. Like the logical propositions that I say these days are so laughably trivial compared to what I spent 3 years proving for my PhD thesis, that sometimes I think, like, God, I learned all that stuff about geometric measure theory, and here what I'm doing is I'm saying, if there is a man in this space, it can't be women only. But that's just a truism. It's not even a logical proposition. So if you think that women should have the right ever to women-only spaces, then we can't have them if men can come into them.
I'm doing a whole PhD, arguably around, are people the same gender as their sex, which, depending how you define it, historically the answer's always been yes. It doesn't even make much sense as a question. And think of what you could be doing years of research on instead. And so much of our public discourse is around such a basic issue. So on one hand, I think, wow, what a waste of time. What if actually that's like a red herring? We ought to just ignore it, focus on more important things. Other times I think, actually, there's nothing more important, because if we can't get something so basic, if we can't achieve consensus on that, how are we going to solve AI alignment, for example?
Everything is based on being honest about the truth. Everything that's based on falsehoods is weak, is wrong, is liable to collapse. So unless we're honest about basic facts, we can't build anything. So, the basic facts are all in flux now. We're lying about all sorts of differences between men and women, between gay and straight, between children and adults. I mean, that's part of what we've been saying, that people are adultifying children and infantilizing adults. If we don't get straight about what human nature is, then there's no hope for anything. So in a way, it's the best work we could be doing.
I feel like this walking paradox, because I believe in objective truth, and yet I also recognize these philosophical conundrums. When you try to define a precise definition, the best people have done is gametes. And even then, it's almost a little bit circular, because gametes are effectively saying genome without any of the intersex variations.
I mean, I don't agree on the sex one, actually. I think sex is the nearest to a true binary in nature. The meaning obviously comes from the gametes. The reason we say there are two sexes is there are two and only two gametes. That's why there can't be three sexes, because there would have to be three gametes.
There's a lot of activists trying to undermine this super basic concept. There's a lot of propaganda out there. We have figures like this in Scientific American, YouTube videos, why biological sex is a spectrum with millions of views. The Why Sex is Binary by, Ann Foster Sterling in the New York Times. Discover magazine about why sex is a spectrum. Books about the sex spectrum, the Trevor Project. There's even more stuff that comes out. Scientific American is one of the leading propaganda outlets right now about this stuff. Well, here's why human sex isn't binary. San Francisco Chronicle, sex binary, that's a scientific falsehood according to them. Scientific American, to understand sex is that the number of sexes differs depending on context. Washington Post, we can't look at the body, we need to look at the brain to find out what sex you are, apparently. We're in a full court press now of this scientific literature getting crazy. This has been stated very clearly by Alice Drager in her book, Hermaphrodites and the Medical Invention of Sex. When she says hermaphrodites, she means intersex people, so just keep that in mind. Hermaphroditism causes a great deal of confusion, more than one might first appreciate, because, as we will see again and again, the discovery of a hermaphroditic body raises doubts not just about the particular body in question, but about all bodies. The questioned body forces us to ask what exactly it is, if anything, that makes the rest of us unquestionable. So I think that's kind of the distillation of the argument from intersex conditions, saying that some people are intersex. What really is sex? We can't really say anything about anyone's sex if some people are, have these conditions that sort of blur this line. But this might sound really profound if you don't know anything about what males and females are, but it's just sort of the pseudoscientific woo-woo. It's just completely not true that because some people might, who are at a glance difficult to place in a male or female box, based on their genitalia, that we're all somehow cast into this realm of complete uncertainty. That's just not the case. Most people, like a coin flip, are either male or female. With a nickel, I think 1 out of every 6,000 flips will land on its edge. That doesn't negate the existence of a heads or a tails. And the prevalence of intersex conditions is about the same likelihood of a nickel landing on its edge, from 1 in 5,500. Intersex conditions aren't evidence that there aren't more than two sexes. Intersex conditions don't result in reproductive systems that can or would or did produce a third or fourth type of gamete. So they would need to produce something like a spurg or a speg in order for this to be, in order for an intersex condition to truly be like a new sex, okay? Again, sex ambiguity is not a third sex. So this isn't just scientifically flawed, but it's socially regressive and I think equally sexist to both males and females, both men and women. Thank you. So we can imagine a scenario where you have this boy. Maybe he just went through puberty. It wasn't, didn't produce typical masculine features. He's quite short. He doesn't have much facial hair to speak of. His voice didn't really drop very much. Very effeminate. Maybe he discovered he's now same-sex attracted. He's getting relentlessly bullied on the playground because, of all these effeminate characteristics, and all the other guys are playing football or whatever, doing, traditionally masculine stuff, and they're bullying him relentlessly, and, they're teasing him and saying, "What are you, a girl? You look like a girl. You have all these, feminine features." And then Billy's very distraught, crying, goes to his teacher, to try to ask the teacher what's going on. He says, "Teacher, they're calling me a girl. Is this true? Like, what's going on here?" And the teacher thinks long and hard, thinks about the sex spectrum, everything they've learned, thinks about the gender-bred person, what they've learned from the gender unicorn, what they've learned from the gender elephant. And he pauses long and hard, and he thinks to himself and then responds to Billy, "Maybe you are a girl." And this is really where it leads, when defining what it means to be a boy or a girl, or a man or a woman, or male or female, by these secondary sex characteristics. Billy, under this, this idea, would be a girl.
And most people, it's very uncomplicated because their genome is standard. They have XY chromosomes and the SRY gene hasn't got transposed onto the X chromosome. But if you say that a female is an individual whose body has traveled down the pathway as far as possible, the developmental pathway that evolved to support the production of female gametes, and has not traveled down the pathway that evolved to support the production of male gametes, then you get in all the intersex conditions except for the few chimerism ones. So the two most difficult sort of paradigmatic intersex conditions are 5-ARD and CAIS. So 5-ARD is 5-alpha reductase deficiency, and it's the condition that Castro Semenya has. So this is somebody who is XY, normal levels of testosterone, but cannot metabolize or use dihydrotestosterone. And the only known purposes in the body for dihydrotestosterone are the forming of the male genitalia in utero, and then the growing of body hair in adolescence. So somebody like Castro Semenya is entirely male, except lacking body hair, and was born with abnormal genitalia and got wrongly registered female. And that's why Castro Semenya isn't meant to be competing in women's sports, because as far as everything to do with sports is concerned, that's a male body. And there have been men with 5-ARD who have fathered children. They have internal testes, and they use ICSI, as it's called. They stick a needle in, and they take out some of the sperm and they inject it into an egg. So that's really a male person, and it's their genes that have made them that way. There's just one little glitch. And then the other male difference in sex development is complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. So that person's insensitive to all of it. Their body tries to go along the female pathway because they can't use testosterone at all. So they grow breasts because the testosterone gets turned into estrogen when they're teenagers. They grow curvy. They don't grow body hair. The voice doesn't break, but they don't have ovaries and they don't produce female gametes. But their body tries to travel along the female developmental pathway. Female meaning the developmental pathway that's evolved to support the production of female gametes. So to me, that is a male DSD. This person is XY. To me, that person is easy enough to classify as female in anything above gamete level, because their body tried to go along that level, and it's bodies that we live with. And then you get left with just chimerism, which is people who have cells from two different individuals. And we've never known of a case of somebody who has chimerism who is capable of producing both sorts of gametes. So it's usually that they're infertile, or it'll be one. So I mean, I think you can classify all humans actually as male or female. And that's a neat definition. It's the sort of definition that mathematicians like. Sorry, I like thinking about definitions too. It reminds me very much of the definition of prime number.
Prime numbers are just natural numbers that can only be divided by themselves and 1 without leaving a remainder. Now, that might not seem like anything special, but in fact, prime numbers are the building blocks of the mathematical universe. They're like the atoms of mathematics. And some of the greatest unsolved problems in maths have to do with prime numbers. The number 1 itself isn't considered to be a prime, because if it were, it would complicate some useful theorems, including one that's so important it's called the fundamental theorem of arithmetic.
So mathematicians define a prime number as any number except 1 that's divisible by itself and 1. And that's not because it's logically a better definition, it's because it's in terms of how it's used, it's a better definition. The point of defining primes is in order to do mathematics. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we could have classified that CAIS person as male, and there's a good argument for doing so, but it's not useful.
Right.
I mean, it would be useful if you were like trying to decide whether to remove their testes because they might get cancer, or, you know, you're the doctor. But in the world that we live in, it's not useful to classify that person as male. And they're the only male people I know of that it's useful to classify as female. And so then you think like, okay, so how am I going to do the equivalent of divisible by itself and 1, but not 1? And that's my wording for it, that your body travels down the developmental pathway that evolved to support the production of female gametes.
Every category has edge cases, and it normally doesn't dismantle the categories. You know, almost every human concept has edge cases. In the realm of biology, you've got things like genetic drift, and you've got variation, you've got mutation. But it doesn't mean that there's not 2 categories. You know, I mean, so the vast majority of the small numbers of people that fall into this sexually ambiguous category are still male or female, because there's male presentations of these conditions and there's female presentations of these conditions.
Intersex people themselves are often frustrated by being dragged in, particularly by the trans activists who are almost using them as justification to undermine definitions of biological sex, when in reality, many people would just identify as I am male or I am female with a DSD.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, the fact that there are very occasional people who were wrongly classified at birth or who make you think hard about your definitions doesn't say anything about people who weren't wrongly classified at birth or for whom they fit directly in the definition. And I mean, some DSDs, as you know, come with very significant health challenges. So they have to be identified, and those people will need treatment. And it's quite horrible to imagine using them in this instrumentalized way for other people's identity demands.
Some cultures prescribe how we behave as men or women very tightly. Here in the weird world, not so much. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, a tomboy who was also busy playing classical piano 2 hours a day. I was allowed to do boy-typical things and girl-typical things, and none of that had any effect on whether or not I was or was not a girl. I was. As I have written, what do? Girls become women. Some girls play in the dirt, some girls dream, have tea parties, girls do a lot of other things, but what do all girls do? If they grow up, they become women. Why do you need to start calling yourself the sex that you are not, or pretend that you are the sex that you are not? Because increasingly, starting around in the 70s, or maybe even earlier than that, everything was open.
For David Bowie, no one thought you were a girl.
And, and David Bowie is one of my favorite examples. I loved Bowie. I loved Bowie growing up. He was extraordinary. He was gender bending. And he was also, over in his actual sexuality, he was, bisexual. He was always a man. He never doubted that. No one around him ever doubted that, right? He dressed up flamboyantly and he played with stereotypes and he played with roles. And humans have been doing that forever. We play with role a lot, but it doesn't change our fundamental nature. And
I have this internal double standard for trans men versus trans women. I have a friend, actually, a trans man, female, who's been on testosterone for over a decade. He's a trucker. Like you wouldn't know it. He has a big beard, balding, muscular. Like I have no problem calling this person a man. That means either I've accepted that he's changed sex, except for genitalia, or I've just created an exception.
I mean, the thing is that literally nobody passes in all circumstances. I mean, your friend is not someone that you're having sex with, I presume. So it's not somebody you got naked with and got up close to their genitals. And sexuality and sex are not a small part of human life. So if somebody doesn't pass in sex, then they don't pass.
But then I'm thinking about people who are one sex and then there's a freak accident. A man loses his penis. He doesn't lose his manhood.
It's literally not possible. You know, you can't turn back time. You can't unscramble an egg. Somebody who went through female development, even just in utero, by the way, loads of things are different in utero. Baby boys are born half a pound heavier. They're born more active. They're born more rigid. And they behave differently. And this is back to, the type of feminism that pretends this isn't true. It is true. We know that. And if you have to be denying the truth to deny it. So somebody who's already been through even just the wash of hormones in the uterus, let alone the one at puberty, they're never going to be fully turned into the other sex, even skipping just the genitals.
I don't think it helps me just in those social interactions, because then you have these rare exceptions with people who have been on hormones, and then for sake of consistency, you kind of go against what's intuitive.
I mean, we do that all the time in social affairs, Say if somebody is adopted, I have adopted friends who would say that their adopted parents are their real parents. They hate that expression, real parents. They would say maybe genetic parents, because the real parents are the people who brought them up. I completely agree with that. But then there's other people who feel differently about it. Mm-hmm. And I'd be happy enough to go along with whatever that person felt was the right thing to do, because it's no skin off my nose, and it's a very considerable amount of skin off their nose. So consistency is slightly overrated in social interactions, I would say.
So what I've been playing around with is that puberty is more so the linchpin than the earlier going down the pipeline of towards one sex or the other. And I know that ignores the prenatal effects that are important, and also the chromosomal effects like we're talking about. But when I think of what is my internal radar for what passes or not, it's basically based on puberty's secondary sex characteristics. Now, I've also met a male who was one of the first in the United States to go on puberty blockers, never went through male puberty, and I didn't know. But in either case, especially if I were to imagine that this male who never went through male puberty, if they also received a vaginoplasty, then I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting that you've got to an edge case, and I would push back on it. So one reason that I would be very determined to classify this person as a man is that what's happened to him is a human rights atrocity. That person was blocked from going through the evolved pathway that turns children into adults, with unknown consequences, but probably dire in many respects. And we won't know until we start seeing those people, whether they get Alzheimer's early. That person had the choice to have normal sexual function and perhaps to become a parent taken away from him when he was a child. And denying that he is a boy is denying that what happened to him was a medical atrocity, and I'm not going to do that. I also know a few puberty-blocked young people, not personally, but at close secondhand, like friends or relatives know them. And it's interesting, one of them isn't passable and was definitely puberty blocked properly, really young, and put, I think, 12, and then put on estrogen at 14, and yet has a surprising degree of male features. In particular, narrower, deeper, smaller eyes and, lower eyebrows. It's the eyes that are the most hard to change, even when people get the jaw done or whatever. And very tall as well, by the way. Okay, so you can do that to somebody and they still don't pass, even leaving outside the sexual organs. And then the two others that I know at close second hand are both, I think both of them, I would guess, would have been gay men. They were really notably effeminate little boys. And both of them think this too. They both think they would have grown up to be gay men, and one of them wishes that had been allowed to happen. Let's say sexually in a very difficult place. They both of them do quite BDSM type things. And that's not surprising when you think that they've had their puberty blocked. They haven't had the chance to grow into themselves as fully functioning sexual beings. And so I think they go for more extreme or painful, maybe, ways to do it. But they're still human. They still want human connection. They still want to feel things. And neither of them feels that they can make what would be a normal adult close relationship. And I just don't think that saying that that's just a woman cuts it. And then lastly, I would say this thing about what if a man can't tell? I'm sorry. If you haven't rooted around to the extent that you can tell the difference between actual female genitals and something that could be made out of the skin of a penis and testicles, then something is badly wrong. These are just very different. I've tried to find a way to say this that might make it to some sort of safe for work forum. And the best example I could come up with was if you imagine that somebody was born without a tongue and that you decided you were going to try to make a tongue for them out of some other part of their body, for example, their forearm or their thigh. And you list all the ways in which tongues are just different than the flesh from the forearm or thigh. In particular, your tongue is wet for the whole of your life. And yet it doesn't do what wet skin does, which is to break up, because it's a different sort of skin. It's got muscles right through it. It can curl different ways. It's hypersensitive. It's got a load of nerve endings. It's capable of tasting things. And you're going to put a flap of flesh from somebody's thigh in someone's mouth and then say, see, it pulses. It's like a tongue. You can't tell the difference. No, sorry. You cannot make anything remotely like a woman's vagina that can pass a baby's head through it, that's capable of a certain sort of action in orgasm, that can keep itself clean and moist for an entire lifetime without breaking down. You can't make that out of a man's penis and scrotal skin.
A small fraction of these cases might be genuine edge cases, like these intersex conditions we've talked about. A small fraction are genuinely bad actors with some sort of kink or trying to do some sort of boundary pushing. I think the athletes would also be included in this. And the majority are confused and experiencing some sort of body dysmorphia, particularly the minors, teenagers, particularly teenage girls. And my pragmatic sense is that even though I think I have more openness to those edge cases, like I think the rigid definitions make me less comfortable, I think, well, the more we keep the door open, the more that vast majority of the middle who are just confused, the more likely they are to be confused. And if we can't quickly resolve this, then it's going to seem more like a sensible option.
I think a lot of the teenagers in particular definitely are, not just, it's more than confused, it's they're misled. A lot of them wouldn't have been gender dysphoric at all if there wasn't this particular discourse.
A family can be made up in many different ways.
It's called SOGI, for Sexual Orientation and Gender Identification, a curriculum that teaches public school students gender is fluid. In other words, your gender is not dependent on what parts you were born with, but rather what you feel like.
People that are boys, there's people that are girls. There are people whose gender might be a little bit of both or might even be neither.
Lessons include books about transgender children, such as 10,000 Dresses, and songs like The Rainbow Song.
Gender won't decide the choices we make.
Gender dysphoria used to be rare, and it used to be rare at a time, by the way, that it was more awkward to be a girl in many respects.
Mm-hmm.
Like girls were more constrained, and yet very few girls thought to themselves, oh, I'm really a boy. I mean, they might have thought, like, I wish that people would let me do the things that the boys are allowed to do. But that's a very sensible thing to wish and drives you towards trying to liberate women, So we've created gender dysphoria by putting that idea into people's heads, and it comes back to the ruminating and the encouragement to mental dis-ease in schools and in universities and online. And I really feel that those kids are being used as facts on the ground. They're the kids who are going to need support and consideration and specialist mental and physical health care right through their lives, every one of them, one way or another. And the more of them there are, the harder it is to just go back to saying, sex is sex, this space is for women, this space is for men. If that doesn't suit you, we'll try and arrange a third option everywhere there's space for it. And I think that's something that the trans lobby likes. I think they like as many possible innocent collateral damage. It's easy to be unsympathetic to them. And I think among the adult men, there are quite a lot of bad actors. But the kids, no, they're not bad actors. They were subjected to a cultish indoctrination process and in some cases a medical atrocity. And we owe them our consideration as best we can.
Being trans exists insofar as some minority of people might actually prefer to live their lives that way. And if they're adults, I guess I take this libertarian stance. And if they want to have surgery and hormones, I think it's net harmful. I worry about their future. They're also going to have all these social difficulties. Like legally, what would you do about the toilets, for example? And many of these kids with gender dysphoria are just going to be waiting for their 18th birthday. An 18-year-old is an adult. So I don't like that door open. I also don't like the idea of it should be illegal. I don't know what to do about that. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm willing to accept that there are probably some adults who would be happier if they could go through this surgery and then be accepted as members of the opposite sex. I think it's probably a very small number if you're not trying to suggest sell gender dysphoria, but I think there'll be people like that. The thing is, they can't. They can't become the opposite sex, and that matters for other people. I suppose I have a crystal ball, I can tell which people they are. You're a person who would be happier if we do all these surgeries and then lie to everybody else that you've changed sex and then force them all to accept that in places like toilets and so on. The thing is, I can't do the second bit of it. I can't ever make a man into someone that women must accept in changing rooms, sports, rape crisis centres, an intimate medical exam, whatever. I can't do it. So if we were to say to those people, we can do this surgery on you, but we're not going to change your documents. If people knew you beforehand and still call you a man, we're not going to sanction them, legally. You still can't use the women's toilets at work or anywhere else. If you want to play sport, you're going to be playing sport. And if we said all of that, like, how many people would still go through it? Literally since the very first doctor who did this, part of what they promised was women will accept you as a woman. They gave them letters. They gave them letters telling them, show this letter in the public toilet if a woman challenges you. So then it would be something like, those occasional people who get unbelievably extreme facial tattoos and do things like get a fork in their tongues or get their ears cut off and say that they're snakes or something like that. I mean,
they get judged.
So it would turn into that. And then, yes, there would still be some people who did it because there's still some people who get tattoos all over their face.
Yeah. That sort of allow it, but don't affirm it and don't expect society to.
No one's going to play along with it, same way as they don't play along with it if you pretend you're a snake.
What do you say to the average person who wants to make it better, like myself, or even more undecided, when they encounter these edge cases? They don't want to be rude and use someone's non-preferred pronouns. They're also uncomfortable at the thought of doing it. Maybe they go along with it anyway, just to err on the side of it not getting bullied. I think that's the vast majority of people who have a more common sense understanding of sex differences and are just scared.
I mean, I can't tell anyone else to blow up their lives for a principle. But you have to understand that if you call a man a woman, 99 times out of 100, that man is going to take that as you agreeing with him using women's spaces and doing things that only women are meant to do. He just will. That is the deal. That is what they're told by their activists is their right. So if you want to say to a man, you seem like a nice chap. You do you. Where would you like? But you're a man. That's the only way you can actually say, and don't come into the toilets with me. You're not welcome. It's not okay. That's a boundary violation. All these rights that we have been won by disagreeable people who are willing to make a point that most people would think seems trivial. Like, why did Rosa Parks not sit where she was allowed to sit? It was a principle. It was a seat on a bus,
Many of these trans people think that they're Rosa Parks in standing up, even if they do it in a bullying way.
I mean, they're bullies who think of themselves as social justice heroes. And, they're not even bad people. They've been made bad by the ideology. But what they're doing is bad. If you're a man and you come into spaces if there's a sign on the door that says female and you're male, you're not welcome in there. Doesn't matter what games you play to yourself to say, oh, I'm really female, I'm an edge case, I pass. You are doing a bad thing.